Hello, virtual South by Southwest EDU. Welcome to The Kids Are Not All Right. I'm Goldie Blumenstick. I'm a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And to borrow something from one of our panelists today, Marty Baker-Stein, the provost at Western Governors University, the kids are actually not all right. The deal is here. The kids who are in higher education right now, well, for one, they're really not always kids. Number two, if they are kids, they're not necessarily those happy-go-lucky, carefree, idealized versions of kids that we all hear about in our popular media and in some of our news coverage. And frankly, the kids, they might not even looking for a degree today. They're really a different sort of group. So to start off this conversation with this terrific panel that we have today, I want to turn to one of our panelists, Julie Peller, who's executive director of the Higher Learning Advocates here in Washington, D.C., where I am as well. Julie, can you just give us a little snapshot of the kids who are not all kids? Like what does that demographic look like? Who are these people who are in higher education right now? Run it through for us. And then I'm going to ask you to sort of take on a little project.
Sure. So the kids are certainly not who you see in movies, right? They're not, by and large, playing Frisbee on the quad, going to frat parties on Friday nights, and leaving in 4 years with a degree. They're more likely to be a working learner. A quarter are parents themselves. They're less likely to be living on campus. And about 4 in 10 are not even enrolled full-time. They're enrolled part-time or less. So what they need and who they look like looks completely different than you might see in the movies or harken back to a days gone by in higher education.
And I think all of us on this panel will agree that higher education has a long way to go before it really can say it's doing a great job in serving these students. But I also think credit where credit is due. There's been a lot of improvement even in the last 3 to 5 years in how post-secondary education has been dealing with the students. And I'm going to start with Julie again to just sort of give us a little sense. What's been improved from a policy perspective? We have Marnie who can talk to us from an institutional perspective, and we have Michelle Weiss who can talk to us a little bit about the broader ecosystem. But we're going to start with you. From a sort of a policy perspective, how has the situation improved for what you would call today's students?
I think there certainly is a much greater recognition of this new reality in policy circles. You know, federal policymakers, and frankly, those who work for federal policymakers, this probably extends it mostly at the state level too, tend to look very much like that old school picture of who a college student is. But they are starting to recognize, and especially in this past year with the pandemic, that the needs of today's students are not just about tuition and textbooks. It's about childcare and transportation and food and shelter as much as it is about their academic success. And I think that recognition is certainly there and is showing up in policy approaches and ways to put students in conversations beyond education, beyond just about student aid.
I mean, I think we saw some of that even with the recent CARES Act, right? There was a lot of money set aside specifically for students' basic needs. Would that have happened?
Absolutely.
Do you think that would have happened 3 to 5 years ago even?
I don't think so. You know, I think so. The CARES Act last March, and then the federal government's made a couple of investments since, created for the first time a fund to fund what we call emergency aid to support students for things that came up. I think 3 to 5 years ago, there would have been kind of a tacit understanding that that wasn't really higher education's responsibility. And now they're really looking at who students are holistically and how higher education can play a role in their lives. And so I do think that that is an absolute change.
Marnie, you've been in education and then on campuses for several decades at this point. Along with me, we've been covering this field for a long. You've been in and out of this field for a long time. I guess I'm wondering now you're at WGU and you serve a lot of these students. Sort of most of those are your students, but you've also been at UPenn and UTexas. What do you see at an institutional level about how policies and procedures have changed, even in the last few years?
Yeah, I think for the last 5 years or so, and certainly accelerated by COVID, we've seen uh, uh, an intention on the part of universities, regardless of whether they're on ground or online, to double down on the fact that these students they need flexibility. They can't always be at campus. So we've seen the proliferation of online programming across campus types. We've seen the proliferation of hybrid programming designs. As Julie said, we're really starting to see across community colleges and four-year colleges a more intent focus on delivering alternative financing and 360-degree support for students who may have childcare responsibilities or who may be living below the poverty line or and are financially independent. And I do think we've also seen across universities in that time frame an entrepreneurial spirit rising up around the need to support students not only for that first degree but lifelong. And we've watched the growth of continuing and professional programs that really support students not just as they enter their career, but as they upskill and reskill across their careers. So a lot of movement in all three of those areas that is very exciting. And as I said, really has taken off with the impetus of COVID, which makes all this work that much more urgent.
The one thing that you didn't mention that I thought you would mention is the thing that WGU is kind of known for, this notion of students being able to take courses not necessarily even based on a calendar, but more on sort of on their own schedule to kind of complete things as they finish them.
That's true. That is what we do. I do not think that is something we've seen widespread proliferation of across the country over the last 5 years. I think that is the next frontier of flexibility is that personalization of pace, allowing students to set, as we know, even in most online courses, there are still set midterms and finals. There is still a set pace through a term that a student has to take, whether they are full-time or they are part-time or they are online or they're in a hybrid program. I do think that the next frontier is allowing students to plan that term against their busy schedules and decide when they are ready to be assessed in terms of whether it is a competency-based program or whether it is a credit hour grade-based program, traditional program. That kind of next level flexibility is what these students really need. And it will be exciting to see if institutions beyond WGU move in that direction, because that really is a game changer for students who work while they go to school, have caretaking responsibilities while they go to school, and who potentially just take longer or can move more swiftly through a learning pathway.
I'm glad you said take longer too, because I think this often gets portrayed as like students can go faster, and sometimes they might actually want to go a lot slower.
Right.
Michelle, you're now senior advisor at Imaginable Futures. You've done a lot of this work about lifelong learning at the Strata Education, and before that at Southern New Hampshire, and been advisor to a lot of other kinds of organizations. I'm wondering, you write a lot about and research a lot about the ecosystem that both surrounds higher education and kind of intersects with higher education. And what have you seen in the last 3 to 5 years, recently that has kind of risen up to kind of help the what Julie would call today's students. What we may come up with a name for this by the end of the session, but what's changed? What's changed that you see out there right now?
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because you were mentioning, the sort of misnomer of the kids, and we've actually known for quite some time that this student population of kids has been changing. It's not news to us that we have a much larger non-traditional learner population, but it's fascinating to see still how we haven't fully met these learners where they are. We know, for instance, that a lot of folks are seeking reskilling opportunities who are already in the labor market, who see the need to advance with further education, but they don't know where to go. Their first thought is not necessarily to go back to higher ed, And so, as we think about this need for continuous returns to learning, because there's, my research has been a lot focused on the future of work, and in what's fascinating is the future of work is inextricably tied to the future of education. We are going to have to access more seamless on and off ramps in and out of learning and work. And so far, our systems still remain fairly brittle. I think there are some really amazing sort of spots of light out there, like the work of competency-based education institutions, but still, we somehow are kind of expecting learners to force fit their very nonlinear realities into a rigidly linear system. And we've also seen this massive disinvestment from training on the employer side, where companies have really kind of put the burden on higher education to solve this issue. And so when I look at the ecosystem, I see this real need to sort of knit together a lot of the work of existing stakeholders, whether they're institutions or alternative learning providers or policymakers. There's a lot of solutioning going on, but for a lay job seeker, for someone who's just trying to navigate a layoff or a new job change, it's inordinately difficult to know where to go to access maybe that more precise bite-sized educational pathway that's going to kind of quickly move them along their way. So I think that's the challenge as we think about the work ahead, is how do we start building a better infrastructure to make it easier to move in and out of learning and work, or do both at the same time.
It's almost like some of these systems are starting to develop, but if this was a fiber optic discussion, we'd be talking about the last mile or maybe the last quarter mile. It doesn't connect to people. So we've got our country right now is facing a lot of crises, probably an economic crisis, a health crisis. I might certainly argue a democratic crisis, a crisis of civic education as well. But as we're thinking about what it takes to serve these kinds of students in the immediate future, I think most of us are focused on the economic issues. What needs to happen in the next year or two, really, to help students recover from the economy and help the country recover, and also help these students recover from the economy? What do colleges, and to extend it to the ecosystem, what has to happen sort of in the immediate future? And then I'm going to come back to you, Will, and ask you about a longer range solutions as well. But like right now, what's the immediate need and what has to happen? And I'm going to go back to Julie on some of this, to start with the policy folks, and then we'll sort of work our way back from the policy to the institution to the ecosystem.
Thanks, Willie. I think I'd put what needs to happen in the next year from a policy perspective into two categories. One is a continue to support students with the struggles that they're having and where they are. So let's take student parents, for example. Student parents are really at the bleeding edge of all of the issues, right? They are facing the childcare crisis, they're facing the economic crisis, and they're facing their changing education perspective, as they might have gone to a remote or online learning environment that they've not had before. So it's critical that we don't say, we addressed emergency aid, we addressed broadband access, we addressed some of these critical basic needs for students last spring, so they're good now. That's not quite the case. We need to continue to focus on that. Looking a little bit more around the corner, I think policymakers can play a critical role in addressing some of the ecosystem parts that Michelle was talking about, and not invest in training over here and education over there, and creating a system where students need to choose door number one for short-term training or door number two for a longer degree pathway. The more the policies can connect with one another so that learners can make the choice that's good for them to get back to work tomorrow and to start a career further down the road, or continue an educational pathway, they need to be really mindful of those investments and not further creating silos between training and education.
That's interesting. I mean, I know this happens at every level, state level, as well as federal level, but I did notice that during the hearings for the education secretary, he made a point of talking about those connections with the labor department as well. So there's a little recognition of that, at least at the federal level. Marty, what about at institution-wide? Like, you hear from your students right now, and obviously you're in touch with your colleagues at other institutions. What does higher ed really need to do in the next immediate year or two?
Well, in the near term, we all know higher education, especially traditional higher education, it's not going to move super quickly to some radical new model. But in the near term, I think all of higher education has the opportunity to extend what we've started to respond to COVID. So the online options, the online and hybrid options for students it's so critical for the new traditional or the non-traditional new traditional students who even before COVID, while we're working many times full-time, if not part-time, when they went to school, they need the online options, they need the hybrid options, they need the flexible access to their education, and they need it not just in distinct programs that they might not be interested in, they need it across the board. So as they're making the choice to attend your institution, they know, hey, I can do this while I keep my job. I can access my courses, my instructors online as I pursue my career, as I take care of my family. That's something that has to last. And I hope that institutions don't go back to normal once COVID is through, but they really take the lessons they've learned here and they extend them. And related to that, I think what can be done in the near term is to in addition to having programs online and courses online and instructional access online, to really reflect on what we've learned, what COVID has surfaced about these populations. A lot of these problems with childcare and the need for just-in-time financing, they existed before COVID. COVID just surfaced them. And we now understand a lot more about these problems. And I hope that students will take this notion of emergency aid and extend it into a longer term, more systematic approach to aid in general, sort of 360-degree aid for students who really need it during COVID, but they always needed it. And they're going to continue to need it into the future of work. And finally, I think in the short term, and this won't be a popular idea, but it wouldn't be that hard for educational institutions to tag their courses and their credits and their embedded certificates and their degrees with insights around the skills and marketability of the skills that those achievements lead to, so that as students are learning through any kind of a program, whether it's a liberal arts program or a professional program or a technical program, as they're making their way through that program, they are recognizing explicitly the skills and competencies and value that they're earning with every course so that they can communicate that to their employers and seek promotion and seek advancement in the careers that they're building as they're working toward that first degree.
I hear that from a lot of people that students are actually learning useful things. They just don't always know how to identify it and communicate it. And if they did, particularly right now, that would be kind of crucial. Michelle, do you think there are receptive employers out there? I mean, is the market ready even for that? Can it handle it?
I think one of the sort of biggest limiting factors we have both with employers and with higher ed institutions is this factor of time. We have not solved for it. We don't have a lot of learners with a ton of time off to reskill or to learn new skills. And when you look at what happens within companies, we lay the burden of skills acquisition on the individual to somehow stack it on top of all of their caregiving responsibilities, on top of, stitching together multiple part-time jobs in order to survive. And so the real opportunity here is to figure out how we solve for this most precious resource of time and how we make sure that earning and learning are simultaneous. They're one and the same. They're fast and now. And how do we make that sort of more seamless? And, so that means that employers are, really getting more skin in the game and investing in their existing workforce and providing those mobility pathways within and recognizing that higher ed is slow to move. The real interesting moment here is that, I think we're so desperate to kind of move our in-person classes online for most higher ed institutions. But as we think about the skills that are required for the future, and we think about these really deeply valued human skills like judgment, emotional intelligence, systems thinking, critical thinking, collaboration, all these kinds of skills that we value that we know maybe machines may not be able to compete with us on. How do we make sure that we also build in learning experiences that solve for time? Because these aren't going to be short bursts. You don't learn empathy in an hour, right? You have to practice these skills. So, what can colleges and universities do to translate some of the liberal arts experience, as an example, into things that a 47-year-old truck driver who's newly laid off can actually leverage and practice, in the flow of work? So these are the kinds of questions we really need to think about: is how do we modularize learning, but how do we also make sure that that learning is sustained? It's not just one and done, but that people can build these really important skills for the future of work.
You've hit on one of my favorite topics because I really feel like one of the things that just doesn't happen for the non-traditional student as well is what liberal arts colleges talk about. They teach in like a learning community, right? But we've only got those experiences for people who are in these residential environments. We don't really have them for students who are. It's easily done for students who are commuters or are working and the like. But Michelle, I'm going to stay with you here because now I want to kind of go longer term. And in your book that you just done, Long Life Learning, you talk a little bit about the need for information, and another topic that I care a lot about, the fact that students need guides. Maybe they need help to navigate this system. So longer term, what could be done to like improve the information gap that's out there right now?
Yeah, what's fascinating is we can actually take a cue from some of the longstanding online education providers like WGU, others that have been in the game for a while. Most of their investment actually goes into that human touch. They've realized that how critical the wraparound support services are, and the different kinds of on ramps that I point to in my book also see, as we look at the bottom quartile of our labor market, folks with maybe only a high school degree who are not thriving in the labor market, they need intensive wraparound support services, and they need human touch points. They need coaches and folks who can kind of keep them accountable along the way. That's almost probably one of the most crucial elements of the ecosystem to get right: is how do we make sure that we know who to talk to, who to call? There's certainly different kinds of tech enabled support services and chatbots. People love to think about these as if they're silver bullets, but for a large majority of our learners, they don't go to Google to search for their next job. They don't go to different kinds of technologies to find the answers. So how do we make sure that faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, different parts of the rural or metro regional ecosystem, there are all these services there. Again, it's just not easily understandable and navigable to a person who is in distress.
Marnie, you have a lot of data at WGU about your students, and some of that's probably translatable to the population at large. Are there some things that you've picked up from the data right now that you think would be really important for us to, for higher ed to be thinking about longer term?
Oh, absolutely. I do agree that the coaching aspect of this, longitudinal coaching of a student across a program or across multiple programs toward a goal, is the number one kind of magic element of the WGU experience, which is extensible to other models. It's not rocket science. It's just an intent and a commitment that we have to get every student a mentor and a coach who they're talking to weekly and making decisions about what's the next step. That is incredibly powerful for student success, for credential attainment. And just imagine if that could extend beyond institutional bounds to help students figure out what's the next institution or employment opportunity that's best for me. That is certainly really critical. And then the second thing, which we touched on earlier, is the personalization of pace. When you are working full time, and we all know this now because we're all experiencing it during COVID, you're working full time, you're studying online or face to face, your kids are home, you've got all of these logistical challenges. Releasing pace and allowing students to personalize it, to weave their education around the logistics of their life, or to slow down and really dive deeply into something that they love or that they're struggling with, that is really necessary for this new audience of students to be successful. And that takes a lot of thinking on the part of institutions about how they're going to reorganize to allow that model to flourish inside of their different institutional contexts.
Julie, just real quickly, do you have a thought on one thing longer term? I'm imagining affordability might be getting dealt with a little bit more with this Congress, but are there any measures in accountability or so that students know what they're getting?
So certainly it is time for policy and policymakers to be thinking beyond access and thinking about outcomes. We need to have a national conversation about what are the outcomes that are student-centered, that students can ask, is this the right place for me or not? So much it's not about good or bad, it's about the right fit. But we have not given students the tools or said, here are the questions to ask. And then behind that, and here are the data and the comparative data so that you can say, a student like me has a chance of success here. And federal policy and states policies can do a lot to look beyond those institutional bounds and let learners make those choices.
Great. All right, I want to thank all of you. To say goodbye, I'm going to have you all say goodbye by telling us, since we don't like kids, it's not a good word, what's a better term to use right now to talk about these students? Julie.
Today's students, they're here today, and they are certainly not here, coming tomorrow. So today's students.
Michelle?
Working learners, because no matter where we are today, even if we have degrees or jobs, we're always going to be flexing between working and learning, or both at the same time.
Marty?
And mine's very
Marty?
similar. Mine's very similar. It's the earner learners who are going to be earner learners, not just when they're 18 to 24, but lifelong.
Perfect. Thank you all very much. This has been a great conversation. I've really learned a lot today, and thanks all. I appreciate you all joining us.